Geraint will be helping us to understand what's happening here. And then we're going to be looking at two key projects within that cluster. So we're going to be hearing from Richard Gwilliam, from the who's the BECCS program director at Drax, leading through that work, and Jonathan Briggs, who is directing the Humber Zero project, and really focusing on the CCUS program that's happening in Immingham. And then we'll have a shared Q&A before a break, and after that break, as normal, we're going to have a wider discussion. Chatham House rule applies, so we are entirely open, but we don't share our discussion externally, or we certainly don't identify the source of the insight, and then we can do what we always do, which is look together to try and identify where we can create influence, look towards creating actions, and ideally create some really positive impacts, all of which is going to feed into the report, which will be aggregated up in due course. And this is the penultimate one of these DI sessions as well. So we've got one more to go, and that's on consumption and related matters. But this is the second to last, and that means I probably don't need to remind you that the first half of the discussion is recorded for the public, and so we're making a big commitment to transparency, so that'll be made available, and it will lead through to the climate action report, which will be consulted on via our commonplace platform, which hopefully some or many of you have been using. And then Kat's going to put the link for the commonplace in the chat, by the way. So we're currently consulting on the finance and investment side of things, and mitigating climate change via nature-based solutions, I think, Kat. And so your views and those of your friends and colleagues very much appreciated. So do feel free to spread it into your networks. In fact, please do that. It would be much appreciated. And then we're asking our speakers, of course, to keep to their 10-minute time slots to make sure we've got enough time for the discussion in the second half. Sometimes we've lost some of that time just because people have been so keen to share their insights, which obviously is valued, but we do need to try and keep ourselves on time. In terms of interacting, please do use the chat. Please do use your digital thumbs up. I find it quite hard to see sort of physical kind of interventions sometimes, because there are quite a lot of people on screen. So it's much easier for me to look for a digital thumb or a chat comment, and Kat and I will be speaking to each other offline. So if I miss something, hopefully she will spot it, or vice versa. So that's how we tend to do things. So let me just pause briefly and check that that's all okay. Are there any questions, any concerns? Is everybody happy with that? And if they are, I'm going to ask Clery from the Tyndall Centre to launch us off and present the national vision and give us some of that big picture and the insights that he has from the important work that he's doing. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thanks for having me. Hopefully you can hear me and see my screen.
Yes, we can. Loud and clear, brilliant. And we can see your screen. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. So my name's Diarmaid, from the Tyndall Centre over at the University of Manchester, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher there, working within IDRIC, which is the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre. And I'm going to also be talking about some work that I've done before my IDRIC work, which is part of FAB-GGR, which is a kind of assessment of BECCS and afforestation for greenhouse gas removal. So I think that's quite relevant to this talk today. I'm just going to give an overview of BECCS and CCS and some of the challenges that are facing those. Hopefully we'll get on to the next slide. Yeah, so that would be useful just to start with giving an overview of why we're talking about BECCS and CCS in the kind of global context. There's kind of some model pathways taken from the IPCC 1.5 degree report back in 2018. What we can see here is, firstly, over towards the left, there's two pathways where we're decarbonising very quickly in the short term in the next decade, and that kind of offsets the need for BECCS. But as things have progressed since then, emissions are continuing to go up, and it's looking like we're more likely to be following one of the pathways, kind of the pathway 3 or pathway 4 over on the right there. And that means that we will need this yellow bar that's kind of coming through there with an increased amount and an increased reliance on what's called BECCS here, but I guess it's just generally kind of negative emissions. We're pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. So hopefully that gives an overview of the need for BECCS and for CCS as a fundamental part of BECCS on the global scale. And as part of that, it's going to put reliances on innovations for BECCS and CCS in the coming decades. So I think it's a very important area. Thought we'd move on then to kind of the UK context. The UK is committed to a national target of 20 to 30 million tonnes of CO2 being captured per year. I guess that's mostly from kind of a CCS commitment, but it does apply to BECCS. And planning applications and cluster developments are ongoing for these. And most of the people on this call are probably well aware of it. But our focus of our work in the last kind of couple of years has been looking at the social license for those developments and for those cluster plans. And I'll be talking about those a little bit today. For those, if anyone isn't familiar, the reason that we kind of developed this kind of cluster model is that within the UK, there are kind of point source emissions. And when we look at that on a kind of a national scale, there's kind of obvious places to decarbonise. So these are our point source emissions, and it identifies kind of hotspots within the UK of areas that we should focus our efforts for decarbonising the country. And this has led to the development of clusters. We can see kind of within the UK, there's kind of 6 main clusters that have been outlined, but they're kind of it's constantly progressing. And the numbers that are attached to these are also constantly developing. And that's the primary focus of the work of IDRIC over the last couple of years. And we have focused also on those. I should say that 2 of those, so the Humber, which you'll be familiar with, but also Teesside has been come together to make the East Coast cluster, and that with the Northwest cluster has been identified as the kind of track 1 clusters from the government, which they kind of have made a priority for rolling out the development of those clusters, and that's kind of where our work focuses. So a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about today will be very relevant to the Northwest and Humber cluster, but particularly have actually worked with some of the people on the call in coming to these kind of conclusions that I'll be talking about. But I thought it'd be important to kind of identify that there are different forms of BECCS and different supply chains that are attached to those. So when we talk about BECCS, sometimes it can be considered as talking about a certain type of BECCS. I think it's important to identify as we move forward, there's different options for BECCS, and each of them have a different place within the UK context. So firstly, at the top there, we've got kind of power with residues. So that would be attaching kind of CCS, so carbon capture and storage, maybe to a biomass power station, where we're taking biomass from kind of byproducts of a forest. And that might be talked about kind of from Drax as a UK kind of application of that, and that's obviously within the Humber cluster, so that's very relevant. But there's also different other different forms of BECCS where we might be using different types of biomass, so maybe crops such as miscanthus, and they could be used in different forms. They would be transported in different ways. There may be different energy conversion steps, so maybe using a CHP, kind of that's combined heat and power, and different opportunities for different types of CCS, so post-combustion capture or pre-combustion capture for hydrogen. And depending on the exact supply chain that's being used, that'll have different challenges. And I'll kind of give an overview of the different challenges that might be applicable to all of those. But the kind of main thing here is there's different forms of BECCS, and depending on what we're talking about, they will have different challenges associated with them. Yeah, I should say that was kind of part of the work done as part of the FAB GGR project, which ended a couple of years ago, but I think it's still very relevant. And as part of that, we kind of work with stakeholders to identify some of the kind of key challenges that were identified for BECCS. And we put those challenges under some key headings, which we can see here in grey. And yeah, there's basically this is summarising all the challenges, and there's different challenges in different areas, and it varies depending on which form of BECCS we're talking about. So I'll go through those. These are the numbers here are basically how many times our stakeholders mentioned those. So I'll go through those based on who mentioned what and how many times it was mentioned. So first, the kind of challenges around land and biomass availability. So as I was saying, depending on what type of biomass we're using for our BECCS supply chain, will have different implications on whether it's available in different parts of the country. Is there also the land available to grow that type of biomass, and what are the land implications there? So that's very very relevant. Also, this systems perspective of how does our BECCS kind of supply chain feed into other things, and how ready is it to roll out? So when is it likely to be ready? How will it fit in with other industry applications and alternative routes, and kind of that whole kind of systems approach? There's obviously financial implications. These BECCS supply chains are likely to be implemented by businesses. So a business is going to be thinking very much in terms of the business model there, and what are the kind of key incentives and financial mechanisms that are going to support that. So challenges around that as well. There's also the social side. Very regularly now we're hearing about kind of Just Stop Oil and those sorts of things in the news, and how those sorts of things are perceived in kind of tackling climate change is going to have a knock-on effect in terms of how people perceive climate change solutions. So these BECCS is very much kind of seen as a climate change solution, and what people think of it is going to have implications in terms of its rollout, if people accept it, if people like it in their local area, a whole source of social challenges there. Obviously, environmental impacts, another sort of challenge, and potentially an area for improvement within the clusters and kind of developments. Environmental issues, water, air quality impacts, biodiversity, soil, what are the implications on all of those? And that seems to be key as part of public acceptance for big projects. Do people see it as a kind of a negative effect within their local area from this big project coming? Or do they see the benefits that it's also going to bring? And then obviously the main thing that we're talking about here is kind of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So a whole kind of host of things that need to be kind of in place around the regulation. Is it kind of being monitored in the right way, regulated? And essentially all the kind of positive emissions that are being released as part of the process, are they having and what's the overall impact of carbon that's been removed from the atmosphere, and the permanence of that? Is it leaking further down the line? That's also another whole area.
Just to chip in and say you've got 2 or 3 minutes left in terms of timeline. So
that's fine. Thank you very much. So then we've got politics, again, a whole host of areas, or a whole host of challenges. So to the government that's in place, are they kind of perceiving tackling climate change as kind of one of the key challenges? We've seen that in the news recently with recent pledges, and then also the infrastructure and what kind of policies are in place to kind of support that infrastructure, and then co-benefits. So that kind of relates back to the environmental impacts quite a lot, or the kind of social other opportunities around rolling out these projects, and that's been identified as an area for improvement within these. Thought I'd just relate this back to some of the kind of government work around a BEIS report on public dialogue, and that identified some of the kind of key things that the public thought were required from CCS, mostly around issues of safety, and this was looking at the clusters and what the public thought needed to happen in terms of rolling out CCS nearby them. I'll kind of skip through a few of these and then kind of get to the summary. But generally, there's a need to act on climate change, and that was recognised from the public. There's risk from delays of government in terms of their leadership and the implications that would have on cluster developments, and an appetite to know more from the public, and they wanted to kind of see the data and the evidence behind CCS projects, and they didn't want anything to be hidden. So being transparent is very important. So just to summarise some of those, a clear need to act on climate change coming through from the public. In terms of BECCS, there is kind of some potential kind of scepticism around the rollout of BECCS, and is it actually kind of tackling climate change, or is it kind of offsetting the kind of use of fossil fuels and decarbonising? So they want to get to real zero. So that's been recognised by the public. But it can be seen as very much an opportunity for the area, bringing jobs, bringing money to the area, bringing benefits, and it's been identified that kind of making sure that projects are nature positive, especially that's work from the Humber cluster, was seen as an opportunity within the area. As I said, there's a need from the government to lead this, and they need to be transparent in awarding their contracts around this, and that's going to be key. And also the kind of pace of policy making is going to be important with updates from the US and the EU and where businesses decide to invest.
Fantastic.
Just thought I'd highlight before that, just our next work is looking at BECCS, mostly on the Northwest context, looking at a range of those sorts of things, and there's the kind of publications. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Diarmaid. And obviously people will have access to these slides, but perhaps we can just cut and paste those links into chat as well, so it's nice and easy for people to get access to them. That'd be super. Again, many thanks for that, and it's a great segue through to our next speaker, who's also going to be talking about the big picture, but taking a regulatory lens to things, I think. Kathryn, or you're up as Kat. Do you prefer to be referred? No, Kathryn, sorry, that's Kat Armstrong. Yes, apologies. Yes, no, I was looking at the wrong name there. So, Kathryn, yes. So, if you're happy to take the floor, and 10 or 12 minutes or so, and then we'll have a joint Q&A for yourself and Diarmaid at the end. So, if people want to start popping questions into chat ahead of time, that's great. I'll take those, but if they occur to you towards the end, that's also fine as well. So, Kathryn, over to you.
Thanks very much, and a good presentation to start with, and hopefully I can pick up on a couple of points that you raised there as well. So I'm Kathryn Richardson. I'm an Area Environment Manager in Yorkshire, working for the Environment Agency, and I'm going to talk for the next 10 minutes around the permitting and regulation of carbon capture that we do at the Environment Agency. So our role, what guidance we have in place, some of the key issues that we're working on, and our latest developments and the work we're doing to really promote and smooth sustainable development of technologies and industries that are needed to decarbonise industry on the road to net zero. So yeah, Kat's driving my slides, so if you can move on to the next one, that'd be great. Thank you. So at the Environment Agency, we work under the environmental permitting regulations, and we need to permit many of the energy technologies that are emerging, and operators will need to apply to us for these permits. Operators do need to understand and meet all our requirements. It's really important that we ensure that environmental risks are fully understood and assessed and meet our guidance. And I'll talk a little bit more about our guidance in a bit. So we do require a really high level of protection for people and the environment. We work with other regulators as well to make sure that that risk to the environment and human health is minimised. If you go to the next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about our permitting process, because if you've not been through it before, it might seem quite complicated. But so this is an overview of the permitting process. It's a technical process to determine a permit application. And as was raised in the first presentation, it's really important that this is both robust and transparent to the public. So we're a public-facing organisation, and that transparency and openness in the public register is very important. So our process is different from planning. We're a statutory consultee on planning, but we look at the process and environmental risks for the site. So we don't look, for instance, at the location of the site or issues such as traffic off-site. We look at the technical process. And we're required by the environmental permitting regulations that we work under to consult on certain types of applications with other organisations and the public. So it's to enable members of the public and other interested parties to review and comment on the proposals in the application. So when we decide an application is of high public interest, we can tailor our consultation to particular circumstances. We might consult with the public both before and after we carry out our assessment on an application. So I know that we've got a representative from Drax later, and they've submitted a permit application for BECCS, and we've carried out both local consultation and discussion through Teams to ensure that the public know how to respond to our consultation and what our remit is. So we've got information pages as well on the internet to provide further info. So if you go to the next page. So the carbon capture process, I know this is post-combustion carbon capture, and this slide was generated as part of our Drax consultation. It's a simplified view, obviously, of a post-combustion carbon capture, but using a solvent to absorb and then to separate the carbon dioxide from the flue gas. And I wanted to use this slide to demonstrate really what an activity would include, what would be included under the environmental permit if an operator's adding on carbon capture. So if you look at the beginning, we don't regulate the sustainability of the feedstock. That's not under our remit, and we don't regulate past the carbon dioxide going out of the plant. So we don't regulate the storage of carbon dioxide. But what we do look at is the emissions and operating techniques and everything that's going on the plant from the carbon capture process. Okay, next one. So permitting. I'm going to talk a bit about permitting and a bit about our regulation. So as I said, carbon capture is permitted under the environmental permitting regulations. We've worked to develop best available techniques. So we have these in all the different sectors that we regulate. There's no reference document for carbon capture, so that's been developed. There's been a lot of work going on to develop post-combustion carbon capture best available techniques guidance, and that was published in July 2021. So that's available on the internet under Gov.uk. And it aims to provide the best practice to address the key environmental risks and identifies where this links into other existing regulatory requirements. So we went through quite a process on this to make sure that we could provide the best possible guidance and quality permit applications, and was based on an evidence review and then in consultation with industry stakeholders. So when we receive a permit application, we'll go through our guidance and make sure that it meets everything that's specified there. And our guidance also includes things around the capture rate, the emissions of amine solvents, solvent degradation and removal of degradation products, so the operating techniques that are being proposed. And then we have a specialist unit in the Environment Agency to look at the air emissions risk assessment, and we require dispersion modelling. So again, we've produced more guidance for that. So we look at venting scenarios, as you can see there, and if there are any water quality assessments, water discharges, that would also be included. So if we move on to the next slide. Regulation. So it doesn't end when a permit's issued. So if a permit is issued, the environmental permit tells an operator what emissions to air and discharges to water they have to monitor. And the Environment Agency then continues our role in checking that the operator is doing it properly. And for that, we can use operator monitoring assessment. So that's a process that we can go through, a formal auditing process, and we carry out that process on all installations that we regulate under the regulations. We also look at the operating techniques that were included in the permit application and how the operator is adhering to their management system. Also, we would investigate any incidents that may occur and can take enforcement action. But at the other end of the scale, we also provide advice and guidance to operators on developments and review submissions in line with permit requirements. So if we go on to the next slide. I've mentioned our guidance a few times, and we're really busy ensuring that this gives operators clarity and certainty of what they need for permitting requirements. Our work at present covers further work on carbon capture for different sectors and hydrogen guidance for carbon capture activities and for electrolysis. So over the past couple of years, we've also been carrying out an environmental constraints project. So this has been focused in the Humber and also on Teesside last year. And this aimed to provide an environmental context for low and zero carbon technology. It was evidence and engagement project. So we engaged with local authorities and industry and focused on water resource, water quality, flood risk and air quality. And it really highlighted and brought together the need for climate adaptation in regard to the water environment and flood risk, so that we're building in now that resilience and sustainability. It's key that industry collaborate on these environmental challenges and think about them at an early stage. So as well as following the guidance, we're really enabling that sustainable design at
Kathryn,
this
just
stage.
a quick interruption again from me to say you've got another couple of minutes and then we need to go to Q&A, if that's okay.
Oh, I'm done. That was the end.
Well, there we are. Perfect.
So I hope that gives you a flavour of our regulatory framework and how we continue to develop this.
And magnificently timed as well. So thank you. Thank you very much. So Diarmaid, if you're still with us, I can see your logo there as well. That's great. Are you happy to join Kathryn for a kind of bit of a joint Q&A? So so thank you both for really informative presentations, and I think things that I know participants will have benefited from, but also those who view these presentations subsequently through the public domain will be, I think, really helped by. So on that basis, do we have any questions for our first two speakers?
Can I answer one from the chat?
Yeah, you absolutely you can, Kathryn. Yeah, go right ahead.
So I think it's Emma has said, what is the benefit of permitting if it's not looking at what goes in or comes out? So I suppose I just wanted to clarify a couple of things there. So we don't look at the sustainability of the feedstock, but what we would look at is what types of feedstock there is, what their contents are. That's not necessarily under the carbon capture bit. That's already for Drax, say that's already been through a permitting process, and we look at what emissions can come from that and how Drax are minimising any any potential emissions from that along the way. We would also look at the storage of that feedstock on site. So I hope that helps clarify that. Regarding what comes out, as I said, we do look at the monitoring of the stack emissions, any discharges to water, the abatement that's in place to make sure that that is minimising any risks to the environment.
Well, thanks, Kathryn. Emma, do you want to come in at all on that, or did that cover what you were asking?
No, I think that's okay. Sorry, I can't turn my camera on. It doesn't work with Teams for some reason. Yeah, I guess still, as always, questions around how some of Drax's feedstocks have been permitted, given their origins. But I guess that's a different question that maybe isn't quite relevant to this conversation.
Okay. Thanks, Emma. There's another question on Teams that's just come in from Jenny, from Jenny Patient, saying, asking whether either of you could say a little bit more about how to permit or regulate a process where there's no operational experience at this scale. So I guess that's a question about how we move from concept into operational scale, or how we move up the kind of the implementation route a little bit. And I can see Chris Broom, your hand has gone up, so I'm going to come to you after this question from Jenny. Who wants to go first?
So shall I come in, since it relates?
I think it's more of a you question, yeah.
Okay.
So some of the, with post-combustion carbon capture, some of the technologies are quite established and have been used previously in industry, but yes, there are some emerging technologies as well. What we need to do is look at the evidence that the operator puts forward in their permit application. They'll often have done, well, they'll need to have done pilot scale testing and look at emissions from that. And then it's around how they've designed that and what operating techniques are being used to minimise any environmental risks. We can, in the permit, look at whether the monitoring in place that's required is suitable, so we can follow on from after the plant's been built and keep revisiting that to make sure that that it's operating within the envelope and we have the correct monitoring in place to pick up anything that there is.
Great, thank you. Jenny, do you want to come in at all? I can see, Diarmaid, you put your hand up briefly.
I was just going to say, yeah, just kind of, maybe it's an additional ask of like around the complexities of the supply chains that I kind of touched on. It's more maybe a question for Kathryn. Do you kind of deal with it like kind of case by case, or is there kind of an overarching sort of I don't know, like a framework that you kind of follow? I know that there's like the greenhouse gas protocol, like something that would cover a range of different forms of BECCS, or do you just deal with it kind of case by case as to what sort of supply chain comes in?
Yeah, we can have a envelope, if you like, for so we would look at say the alkali content, if you wanted to get down to that detail, which we do. So we would look at that. The contents of the feedstocks and that envelope that they're working in, and the impacts of those as it goes through the process, and what abatement needs to be in place, especially with emissions to water, for example, and air.
Thank you.
Answer that one. Yeah.
Jenny, keen to give you a little bit of moment to come in before I move to Chris. So if anything that you want to sort of add to or sort of build on your question.
That would be good, actually. Yes, I mean, I know we're hearing from Jonathan later, and we did a visit as the unions to VPI Immingham, and I'm just going from what they said there about sort of that it's a process that exists and is in use operationally, but not at the scale which is implied by, for example, Drax's application. So, and I'm just kind of going back to things that their previous experience. I don't know how much anybody knows about this, but like building regulations in the UK were done, they were changed to be done on a kind of design. Well, we'll check the design's okay, and if we think the design's okay, we'll let you do your building regulations, let you build your building that way. And that's how we ended up with the Grenfell Tower. So I'm, regulating things purely on the basis of a design does have risks. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that kind of issue. I don't envy you your job, but I'm just kind of curious as to know if those kind of risks have been thought about, and whether that's whether we can really go from something on paper that works on paper to something that we don't have any kind of practical experience of.
Yeah,
I mean, trade unions, we're very much into practical experience and operational. We're there in the workplace. We're seeing how things actually happen in practice rather than how they happen on the drawing board. And I suppose that's why we would want to understand the health and safety implications of things that haven't been done yet.
Yeah, that's a really important question, a really strong build, Jenny. Thank you. And what I'm going to do, really just with half a mind on the clock, but also to sort of link questions together is perhaps invite Kathryn and Diarmaid to kind of reflect on exactly what you've asked there, Jenny, but also to pick up on Chris Herring's comment in the chat, which talks about ensuring long-term reliability of storage and the issues that may sit around that one as well. I know it's not exactly what you're asking, Jenny, but they're
no,
kind
but
of...
I think you've missed a question from Martin as well, which
did
relates
I
to
really?
that.
I'm sorry, where was that? Yes. Okay. So the regulation, the pipeline, the long-term storage, if not the EA. Okay. So that is one that Chris was building on. So anyway, so perhaps Kathryn, Diarmaid, or the other way around, if you could maybe pick up on those themes about how we deal with these unknowns and deal with really taking a big old step into industrializing a scheme that's not been necessarily developed at scale to date. That would be really interesting.
Shall I go first? Even though my first declaration is not necessarily my area, but there does need to be a mechanism. Yeah, it's definitely there needs to be a mechanism in place, I guess, to put the onus on somebody, whoever's doing that storage, to continue to monitor that. And then there is a timescale question around at what point do you kind of declare that as like a safe thing that's stored underground. It's more of like a more question provoking, I guess, than any real answers around that. Yeah, sorry. Good question though.
Thank you, David. Any thoughts from you, Kathryn, at all?
I can't talk about the storage part. That's not my expertise. But I suppose coming back to Jenny's point around the unknowns, these processes have a permit application is not a fait accompli. So we would ask if we've got concerns, if there's no if it doesn't meet our guidance, or we don't, the designs aren't clear, we think they could do more, we would go back and ask further questions. We do require information about pilot plant scale. So I suppose it's not necessarily going from paper to full-blown design. And maybe in the next section, people will talk more about what they've been doing. So it's building on that information and experience. If we're satisfied and issue a permit, as I said in my presentation, the job doesn't stop there. It will continue to look at whether they're meeting those permit requirements, and they're achieving what they set out in their permit application and proposals.
Noted. That's great. Thank you. Mindful of time, we have had two hands up for a little while, so I'm going to make sure that Chris and I think Martin get to come in, and then we'll move on to our next speaker. But Chris, would you like to come in now?
Sorry, yeah, excuse me if this is uncomfortable, because yeah, the really big issues need addressing, and as far as credibility of applications is concerned, the UK has always abandoned every full-scale CCS project from about 2009, since we started having them, because government wouldn't fund them. No CCS plant that I'm aware of, certainly not in hydrogen as power, has ever achieved anything like 95% capture, all their own design capture rates. Most projects have failed. There isn't much documentation around the world. All CCS plants that are being designed are designed to work to higher capture rates than have ever been achieved. We're having problems with workforce even to do things like insulation. So on a really difficult new technical scheme like a CCS project, we're going to have skills problems. All our like most of the projects that are being suggested are bigger than anything that's been going on in the world. And even if you achieve 95% capture, of the emissions that you can address on a CCS plant, they're going to be going on for beyond 2050. So you're having to rely on even more speculative technologies to offset the emissions that you're creating. So I accept that we've got a problem anyway, but I think we're being driven along by a fossil fuel narrative and a big business, we must have economic growth narrative. And we're just creating more and more faith, in technologies that probably will not work. So sorry to fire all that out.
No, that's okay. Hey, listen, this is what these sessions are for, Chris. They're for open conversation, and they're for for us to have challenging conversations. But what I'm going to do is ask our two speakers to kind of just press pause on that and bring Martin in as well. Get Martin's question or comment, and then ask Diarmaid and Kathryn to reflect on both. We'll hear from Martin in just a moment, and then that means that I know that we can close out after whoever speaks last between our two first speakers, and we can move into the next speaker segue, which is just helpful for me from a time management point of view. But thank you, Chris. No need to apologise at all. Martin.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, I suppose my question is really about the regulation, leaving aside all the other issues that Chris has raised. But in terms of once the captured carbon leaves the plant and then has to go to intermediate stations for pumping and then external storage, if the EA are not regulating that process, then who is? Because I can't see any other public body that would regulate that. So it may not be your team, Kathryn, but it seems to me that's an EA function to regulate the pumping stations and the long-term storage, unless it's seen that it sits with the Oil and Gas Authority. But I'm not sure that's within their current permitting or legislative requirements at the moment. So that's the key thing for me, is that the EA seem to have been given the responsibility for permitting the storage of the fuel. Whatever the fuel happens to be that goes into the process, that then the carbon is captured and you regulate the capturing process within this plant. But unless I'm mistaken, it seems that there isn't actually once it leaves the plant, it's not clear to me who regulates it once it's left the boundary and is travelling across the country to its North Sea storage. And that's a bit under, and I think we need to understand, to have a full picture of what that regulatory process looks like for the whole of, and I suppose, for the supply chain of the process.
Great, thank you, Martin. So what I'm going to suggest, if it's okay with our two speakers, is Kathryn, if you want to take that first and obviously pick up on the specific kind of regulatory type question that Martin has just raised there, and reflect to whatever extent you wish on the comments and queries that Chris was raising, and then we'll move to you, Diarmaid, to have kind of last words and reflections given the big picture stance that you were able to adopt, and then we'll go into a 10-minute break. So if that's comfortable for both of you, that's what I would suggest.
So I'll kick off. So the Environment Agency don't regulate the whole carbon capture thing on our own. And as I said in my presentation, we work with other regulators. So I think I'm going to get this right, but if there's someone on the call who wants to correct me, that's fine. So the HSE are in charge of regulating pipelines. So they take that part of the process, and then I think the North Sea Transition Authority regulate the offshore storage of carbon dioxide.
Super, thank you. And just to correct my misspeak, we're not about to have a 10-minute break. Thank you for flagging that. We have more speakers to come, and then we have our break after that. So apologies if anybody was building up to put on the kettle or dash for a comfort break. So we do have more speakers to come before our break. But Diarmaid, over to you. And Rosa, I know I can see that you want to come in too. So let's go to Diarmaid, and then Rosa, if you want to jump in as well, that'd be great.
Sure, I'll mostly touch on Chris's question, I guess, as I feel like I touched a little bit on that around the kind of public skepticism of tackling climate change and kind of the kind of ongoing tackling fossil fuels and our kind of reliance on that, as that's kind of some of the work that that we've seen coming through from our work, and why we're looking at the social license for these sorts of projects. Is a very kind of interesting question, I think. Firstly on the kind of CCS projects, yes, it's definitely important to kind of mention that there has been failed projects before. The only kind of thing I could say, it does seem to everyone says it feels different, right, because of this kind of shared investment and how the government have made improvements. They've learnt from what didn't work last time. There seems to be shared investment from businesses, also shared investment from the government, which seems to be definitely improvements. I'm not saying 100% that it will work, but it seems to be a better approach, and we need to. CCS does seem to be, as I kind of showed in the kind of illustrations of how we get to net zero and limit global warming as much as possible. It does seem to be relied upon and essential, no matter what route you take. And I think it's still a risk, is that it's kind of used to kind of continue to slow our actual hard to tackle decarbonisation problems. I don't, it's been identified as a risk for a long time, and it's still an ongoing risk. But we do need to scale up these technologies in whatever way possible. Hopefully that is alongside the primary focus of decarbonising, and then adding on this BECCS or negative emissions to remove the really hard to abate sectors. So all I can say is just I hope it is done in that way, and we continue to highlight that as a problem.
Thank you, David. Rosa, would you like to come in, and then we'll move to our next speaker, who is Geraint Evans. But Rosa, I know your hand is up, so please jump on in.
Thank you very much, Simon. So, hi everyone. I just wanted to share a reflection that it's actually come up from across a couple of panels, and I think it's I'm really delighted Kathryn's been able to join us today and to share the Environment Agency sort of process and the constraints within which that we operate. So we have a very tight remit. It's an incredibly important one, and it's managing here and now risks. And I think there's real for the panel and anybody who watches this afterwards, I think it's a really important point to understand that whilst we've got the name Environment Agency, we don't have a remit as broad as people might expect, and we continuously come up against that in a range of different conversations. So it was just to emphasise that point, really. So the work that Kathryn's team does, they regulate the industrial cluster and the emissions coming out of an industrial cluster that's the second most polluting in Western Europe, and they make sure that those operations don't, cause as little harm as possible to the environment here and now. And those wider sort of systems level conversations that we're used to having in this panel, I think there's some really important questions sort of hidden behind the questions that have been asked today, if you like. Okay, so who is looking at that system as a whole? And how is that working? And how do we build on that? And I also wanted to say as well, it's really important not to lose sight of those environmental constraints that have been identified. That was at the end of Kathryn's presentation there, in terms of how do we expand and do this scale up, and what are those very real challenges about the place in which we're trying to do this scale up in our lovely region. That was it, Simon. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Rosa. And look, I'm happy for us to bite into the more open conversational section, the back end of this call. As sometimes happens, we have the richer conversations stimulated by our excellent speakers, as has just been demonstrated. But I'm also keen to make sure that we keep broadly on time, because I know that some of our speakers have to drop off and go do other things. So with that in mind, I'm going to switch now to Geraint. So if you're happy to take the floor, Geraint, and maybe introduce yourself, and then just we'll sit back and listen to you for the next 10-15 minutes.
Hello. Can you see my slides?
We can see the slides and we can hear you very clearly.
Right, okay. I'm speaking to you from North Wales because I was meant to go to the Anglesey show last week, according to my father, but he realised he was a week out because it was the Eisteddfod. So I'm just looking at the beach right now, rather than speaking to you from Humberside, which is where I usually speak from. I'm just trying to get this to go into presenter mode. There we go. So I'm going to, my name is Geraint Evans. I'm managing director of my own consultancy. Up until March, I was the chief engineer for the Humber Industrial Cluster Plan. That project finished beginning of April, funded by UKRI, led by Catch and the Hull and East Yorkshire LEP, and supported by the companies you see below. I'm a chemical engineer, fellow of the Institution of Chemical Engineers, and I lead the Clean Energy Group for IChemE. So quite interesting, some of the chemical engineering questions you've been asking. With respect to chemical engineering practices and comfort in knowing that any chemical engineering process that goes in is going to work from the off. So I'm going to talk today about our project that we did, but with a focus on CCS, because we took a system view looking at decarbonising heavy Humber industry, and I'm not talking about transport here, I'm not talking about heating homes, just heavy industry system view. And the outcome is that you need every tool in the box, and each tool in the box, be it wind, solar, nuclear, CCS, biomass, they all have an Achilles heel or a weakness or a risk, and it's how we balance those risks in the energy system as a whole that minimises those risks. Unfortunately, we have to live with the risks and manage them. We've already heard today that the Humber is the biggest industrial cluster by emissions, and I'll add a word to that: existing emissions, because as we move to generate more hydrogen from natural gas, because hydrogen made from natural gas will give you scale, from electrolysis will give you cleanliness, they have to be balanced, you will make more CO2. And so the numbers you'll see from Teesside, Humber and Merseyside as we start making hydrogen will increase. There's various different numbers for emissions from industry. We calculated it out as 14.6 million tonnes. We've seen 12.5 today, which is a slightly older number. And if I add power generation used by industry, we get to about 20 million tonnes. The 4.1 has already gone, if you're looking at that bottom bar that says 24.1. But of interest to me, what I find interesting is that around 85% of those emissions come from just 3 industries, and indeed, therefore, 3 fairly large sites, fairly large locations in the Humber region. So we have refining at Immingham, that's the biggest, closely followed by steel making at Scunthorpe, and then quite about way back in 3rd place is chemicals, mainly salt end chemicals, where they make things like acetic acid. So by addressing those 3 sites, we get around 85% decarbonisation. And to put that in context, that's about 4% of UK total emissions. So it shows you the opportunity and the need to decarbonise Humber. Not only that, we have a lot of benefits in the Humber region. And thinking today about CCS, I'm just going to focus on 2 of these points. The first is that CCS is going to happen down the east side of the UK, because that's where the main storage is. So from Scotland south to Norfolk, and that's where you'll see CCS happen in the main. There is some going on in the northwest, but that's a smaller store. The store in the northeast side of the UK is bigger. So that brings a problem for industry in the Midlands, down south. If they're going to use CCS, it's how do you get the CO2 over to Humberside or Teesside or Scotland? And secondly, greenhouse gas removals. This is a process to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, clean it and store it permanently. We can't minimise our way out of this problem we have with climate change, because there will always be residual emissions. We've heard that already today. They can be made fairly small, but you're going to have classic cars roaming about emitting CO2. My father-in-law is into his coal-fired steam trains. CCS has a leakage rate. It's currently about 90 to 95% at best, limited by economics in the main. but Energy Systems Catapult says we have to get to 99% to reach net zero. And if you're into academia, if you're an academic, this is a key area of research that needs to be looked into. We need to improve what we can do today. But industry is challenging to decarbonise. Two key points here I'm going to focus on rather than go through each of them individually. And the first one is the most important, because when we make things from chemical feedstocks, be it natural gas, be it oil or limestone, then to make that product you emit CO2. Now, people will say, well, we're just keeping the fossil fuel industry going. Well, actually, we need lime. That comes from limestone, calcium carbonate. You burn limestone and it releases the CO2 that was sequestered in the stone. The only way to make lime low carbon is to capture CO2 with CCS. So if we want lime, we have to do that. Similarly, acetic acid, if you want vinegar on your chips from the chip shop, or to use silicone sealant or paint in the future, our current paradigm says we make it from natural gas. We explode it in oxygen. And that happens at Saltend Chemicals Park. And while we could use biomass to make the syngas, there's not enough biomass about to use it in chemicals and to use it for full-scale BECCS process. And that's around 45% of industrial emissions. So that shows you how important it is to think about driving forwards, despite the discomfort we may have on CCS. And at the same time, we need to maintain business competitiveness. We can't just go hell for leather and just make everybody go out of business. We have to do this in a balance and do it carefully. CCS, of course, is not the only tool. I'll pick out on electrification because I was taught as a fuel technologist at Leeds University that primary energy is coal, gas and oil, but I would argue that with wind and solar, electricity is becoming a primary energy source. So we should use that first and foremost and not convert it to, say, hydrogen if we possibly can. We should use it directly, for example, in electric vehicles. But a lot of the technologies that we need in industry cannot be electrified just yet. Kilns, very high temperature kilns at ConocoPhillips to make electrode coke to recycle steel can't be electrified just yet because the technology is not being developed yet. We've relied on gas-fired furnaces for so long. Now, I mentioned that I was the chief engineer for the Humber Industrial Cluster Plan. We finished working on it in late March, and out of it came seven mandates for action. We decided not to put actions in place because actions go out of date quite quickly if you're not careful. So these mandates tell people, yes, go away and work on CCS or go away and work on BECCS. You're doing the right thing. And out of these technical mandates, I point you to the order that they're in here. We would normally, in any argument about technologies that we want to develop, start with number 4 there, resource efficiency and energy efficiency. But the reason that is at number 4 here is because whilst it is the most important in terms of how you do things, it's not the biggest in terms of capability to reduce emissions. We're talking here about 35 to 56% of emissions need to be abated most economically using CCS, and that we should implement it at pace and scale across the Humber. We took an energy systems modelling approach to understanding how the pathways might flow in decarbonising the Humber. And looking at this chart, this is 4 scenarios that we came up with. And along the y-axis, we got Scope 1 emissions from each factory of CO2 per year on the left-hand side. And across the x-axis, going across the bottom, we have dates out to 2040. For we had a target of meeting net zero by 2040. And the first line to look at is the black one across the top. This is business as usual. Element Energy did this for us. And you can see that whilst we decline in our emissions, we don't get anywhere near net zero by 2040. And the decline is mainly because Humber loses competitiveness because we're not decarbonising. So in fact, we actually have to do something according to this if we want to get to net zero. Now, looking at the 4 coloured lines, you can see that every scenario gets to a very low level, and each one has residual emissions of around 500,000 tonnes a year, because you get to a point where either it's too difficult, it's impossible, or just so expensive that it's cheaper to invest in a greenhouse gas removal. So we can get to net zero, and we'll look at that in the next slide.
Geraint, two or 3 minutes left, if that's okay.
Okay, so the rates of emission reduction can be different, but you've got to think that there's more cumulative emissions with the red one compared to the green one. I'm going to slip off this one. I will talk more about it, but I can do later if you ask. If we overlay on that chart Drax's plans as they were at the beginning of this year, you can see that actually if we had a CCS pipeline out to Drax built, then by 2030 we could be net zero in the Humber region, and by 2040 we could actually be very negative on emissions in the Humber, showing the importance of the Humber region and indeed Drax as nationally important in terms of achieving the country's net zero goals. Now I put this up because it just shows the plans for CCS pipelines. You've probably heard recently in the news that Viking CCS had achieved Track 2 status for their pipeline, which goes from Immingham at the Phillips 66 refinery point there, southeast to Thedlethorpe and then out to the Viking fields. But we also have a project that goes east-west from Easington to Saltend to Immingham again, out to Drax. That is zero carbon Humber, and that joins up with the Northern Endurance Partnership, or East Coast Cluster. I think it might be named now. Somebody will correct me later. Both of these are hugely valuable to the region. The main point I want to say is that if you're ever looking at projects in the Humber, do look at it in some detail, because there is a lot of projects and they overlap and interlink, showing that collaboration is absolutely key to work together to deliver this solution to the challenge that we have. So finally, I always say this, climate change is an urgent issue about moving. It's about moving ancient buried carbon to the atmosphere as CO2, and it's tipping us out of balance. The Earth isn't going to die, but 400, 500 million years ago, when all the carbon that we have now was in the sky, it was just too hot for any mammals or dinosaurs or anything to live. So it's important that solutions address what is the real problem, i.e. we're digging carbon out of the ground and putting it in the sky. But it's not just CO2 that's important. We have to think about clean air, healthy soil, food supply, etc., etc. Our 7 mandates for action from the Humber Industrial Cluster Plan highlights the importance of CCS in the region for decarbonising and positioning our industry for the future. And alongside that, BECCS is absolutely critical to achieving net zero. We cannot get to zero without some negative emissions or greenhouse gas removals. And I reiterate what I said at the beginning, that we have to have a portfolio of solutions, because each technology option, CCS, BECCS, nuclear, wind, have some sort of risk, and we balance those risks out against each other. You place your technologies where they fit best, at the scale they're best, and where they'll work best. So that's me. I'll finish off and take questions when you're ready. So I'll hand back over to Simon. Kat, have we lost Simon?
Simon, have we lost you? I think Richard is up next. If Simon's lost his connection. Richard, are you able to give us your presentation? Right, thank you.
Good afternoon. I think you were going to drive, weren't you? Is that okay?
I was. Thank you for the reminder.
That's okay. Otherwise, I might have had an IT malfunction. That's great. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Gwilliam. I'm the UK BECCS Programme Director for Drax. I'll be talking through our proposals to implement a bioenergy with carbon capture and storage project at the power station and provide a bit of context on the plant, its history, etc. today, and also perhaps offer a modest build on the words that Diarmaid talked through in terms of the need for greenhouse gas removals and indeed the comments that Geraint has made regarding the need for CCS and Humber, because the Humber, as has been already outlined, is a significant and internationally significant opportunity to decarbonise. And as Geraint said, there's an awful lot of projects in the region. I think one of the successes that we've had is by showing high levels of cooperation to come up with coherent solutions that help all these industries decarbonise on a pathway that will help us reach net zero. Anyway, the focus is on Drax for the next 10 minutes, I think. Cap, so if you can press the next slide, I'll start. So this is Drax Power Station. Drax is still the largest power station that we have connected to the UK's electricity grid. The plant was first commissioned as a coal-fired power station in 1974, so it has been sort of integral to the operation of the UK's electricity transmission system for many years now. But since 2012, we've set about converting from a coal-fired power station into a sustainably sourced biomass fueled power station. So at the plant, we have 6 electricity generating units. Each of those are in effect a mini power station within themselves. 4 of those now run on sustainably sourced biomass. The 2 remaining coal units ceased to operate commercially a number of years ago. We had planned to decommission 12 months ago. The government asked us to keep those available over the winter in light of the enduring challenges brought about by the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But now that that contract has terminated, we have set about dismantling those units from operation. I think it's probably sort of useful to set out. Geraint used a fantastic line around Drax being internationally or nationally significant in the decarbonisation journey. And whilst we have converted the power station from coal to biomass, the next step is to look at how we capture the carbon dioxide that's produced when you generate electricity through biomass and capture that. And because the CO2 comes from a biogenic fuel stock, we're able to create a carbon negative footprint with all the CO2 that we capture. That's a plant and a project that we've been working on for a number of years. And then, Kat, if you can press the next slide, there's some information about that. So this is a retrofit project. There's a slide similar to Kathryn's actually that sort of depicts the process, but the process and the technology that we're setting out is post-combustion capture attached to the existing power station. And for each unit, each of the 6 units, you remember I talked about the 6 units, but each of the 4 biomass units that we convert to have BECCS capability will allow us to capture and permanently remove 4 million tonnes of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year. The immediate plan that we have at the moment is to convert 2 units. The plant was built the plant is configured largely in pairs, so you get certain economic efficiencies if you convert units in pairs. We had planned for the first unit to become operational by 2027 and the second one coming online 2 years after, but the sequence of the build would have been doing some of those works in parallel. That was premised on Drax becoming a track 1 project pursuant to the government's cluster sequencing process. I think, as is well documented, the Humber didn't receive any projects within track 1. So we're now recalibrating when we will deploy BECCS at the power station, but we are guided very strongly by the government's own 5 million tonne target for greenhouse gas removals by 2030. Operationally, the plant would run on a base load basis. You maximise the removals from carbon removals if you run on a base load basis, and obviously that brings sort of 2 products. One is the carbon negative footprint, and 2 is the power. So as you can see here, the plan is for the first unit to be deployed by 2030 and the second unit to be deployed hopefully shortly after that. This is a long-held ambition from Drax, we first started talking about bioenergy with carbon capture and storage back in 2017. And since 2019, we've had 2 pilot plants in operation at the site. One was operated by a company called Sea Capture, who were an organisation that came out of Leeds University, who were using a novel non-amine based solvent to capture CO2. And the other one was operated by Mitsubishi, using one of the more conventional solvents to remove CO2. Both of those provided fantastic learning opportunities for how you deploy CCS at the scale that we're planning to do at Drax. We have completed pre-feed. We are most of the way through our feed study for that 2-unit conversion. And you can see from here that we've done that in conjunction with Worley. The development consent order, because this is an amendment to a large power station that require consent through the national process, the development consent order. That was submitted a number of years ago. The examination for the project finished on the 17th of July this year. We're now in the planning officer's recommendation stage, and then it goes to the Secretary of State decision. So we expect to get a decision on whether to grant development consent in January next year. As Kathryn talked about the environmental permitting process and the consultation that the Environment Agency have completed on the Drax application. What that means is, in effect, that our application has met duly made status with the agency, the Environment Agency, and they are in the process of deliberating on that. In terms of sort of government policy, the biomass strategy, a really important document with regards to the sort of the UK's direction on the deployment of biomass at scale, and indeed BECCS was published last week. I think for anyone who's interested in this topic, it's really worth engaging in both that document and the scientific report that accompanied that, which was geared up towards trying to demonstrate that CO2 captured through a BECCS process constitutes a genuine carbon removal. It's a very thorough and comprehensive piece of work with some, comprehensive piece of work that does sort of warrant detailed consideration if people are interested in that topic a little bit more. We are in ongoing discussions, or the UK government is ongoing discussions as to the regulatory framework, the economic framework that it will deploy to support BECCS projects. I think during the previous presentations, a few people talked about CCS failing in the UK. I've been involved in CCS in the UK since 2010. I have worked on some of those projects which stopped. The reasons that they failed ultimately was down to the maturity of the business models and the economic circumstances rather than a technological issue of failing. It's probably important to point out that CCS as a technology has been in operational for many years all around the world. If you take Norway as a great example, the natural gas that they have in Norway has high quantities of carbon dioxide in it. They had to find a process of actually stripping CO2 out of methane. They did that, and they stored it and have been storing it successfully under the North Sea since 1996. So there's some useful precedents in addition to the pilot work that we've done that the whole industry's able to draw upon. But government is making progress on that previous sticking point, which is the business models, to allow investment decisions to take place to deploy not just BECCS but other forms of CCS technology around the UK. The next slide, please, Kat. I'm not going to elaborate too much on this one. It's Drax's version of a diagram I think you've probably seen in many cases, but nevertheless it's an important context as to how a post-combustion capture system would work and how we would deploy it at Drax. What I will do though briefly is talk about number 6 on the diagram, which is what we do when the CO2 is captured and goes off site, because that is a topic that's come up earlier during this conversation. Effectively, the battery limits for the Drax power station would be the existing fence line, and a third-party operator would bring a pipeline to the power station to take the CO2 away. The way that Geraint has some great diagrams that illustrated maps through the region. We are blessed by a number of opportunities to take the carbon dioxide, but the ask, and I think the common ask for all these projects, is the deployment of a large-scale pipeline. sufficiently sized to take the CO2 that can be captured from all of these plants through the Humber region and off for permanent storage in the North Sea. So Geraint also talked about the Viking project, which recently received Track 2 status from government, and the East Coast Cluster project, which recently Track 1 status. Both of those have storage facilities in the North Sea that can permanently store carbon dioxide, but it's useful by way of context to know that the North Sea Transition Authority recently granted, or provisionally granted, an additional 13 sites off the Yorkshire and Lincolnshire coast for storing CO2. So not only do we have a significant opportunity in the Humber region to capture a lot of CO2, we have a significant opportunity to store it, blessed by the geology that we have, as Geraint has set out for CCS. Next slide, please, Kat. This is, I guess, a modest build on some of the comments that Diarmaid made at the start of the presentation. This talks about quite a useful diagram to depict why carbon removals are necessary. The UK government, as was set out earlier, plan to capture and store 10 to 20 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per annum by 2030. They have set an ambition for 5 million tonnes of that to come from greenhouse gas removal technologies like BECCS. To get to the sort of balanced pathway scenario for the carbon budget 6 set out by the CCC, we need to be storing around about 250 million tonnes of CO2 by 2035, just to put that into context. And by 2050, to meet net zero, again on that balanced pathway scenario the CCC have set out, we need to be storing around about 1.6 gigatons. Now, you can see that we're expecting a large-scale increase in CCS to help us meet net zero, but even with large-scale deployment, we will still be set out with a number of residual emissions. Now, Geraint gave a helpful example of legacy industry, cars and trains, etc., that will still emit, but we expect that the majority of CO2 that will still be emitted into the atmosphere under the balanced pathway scenario will come from agriculture and aviation, which are two very difficult to abate, but work's been done in those places, but nevertheless two difficult places to.
I feel awful in interrupting such an amazing sequence of presentations, but you have a couple of minutes left, Richard. So
that's absolutely fine. No problem at all. But this is quite a useful depiction that demonstrates or illustrates why, with offset of positive residual emissions, we will still need carbon removal technologies to balance that off. Yeah, I've just seen a comment come through on direct air capture, and clearly that's referenced on this chart, an important part of the way we balance that. Next slide then, Kat. I'm just going to whiz over this one really quickly, but this is some of the academic institutes and global organisations that have also opined on the need for carbon removals and set out some bold targets as to why large-scale carbon removals is necessary. So there'll be names and organisations that you're familiar with there. And then the last point I wanted to make on the next slide, Kat, if I can, I am rattling through this obviously, is just that not only does this present a significant opportunity to decarbonise UK and to meet our net zero targets, but there are economic benefits that come with it as well. And specifically in relation to Drax, we're forecasting that during the construction of the power station, we will be creating and supporting around about 10,000 jobs in the region, and then on a permanent basis, once the plant is operational, there's over 3,000 jobs. So this is a significant opportunity. Geraint put it in better than me in terms of the sort of national significance of this, but there are organisations globally looking at deploying BECCS at scale. I think we were very quick and early out of the box. We're now not the first to deploy BECCS, but we need to capture the opportunity. We need to act now to make sure that we reap the benefit, meeting both our net zero targets and creating long-term prosperous economic future for the region. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. That's great. And sorry I dropped off line briefly between Geraint's and your presentation, but they sequenced together so really very well. So that's been a really valued contribution. Thank you. And I know you've set Jonathan up really well also for taking some of the some focus in terms of other key projects in the region from a Humber Zero point of view. So I'm not sure whether to pronounce it Vitol or Vital, Jonathan. So perhaps you can kind of correct me on how that's pronounced, and then take the floor from here.
Yep. Thanks, Simon. It's not really vital or VTOL. It's a VPI, so VTOL Power. It's a subsidiary. But let me share my screen. I've got 5 or 6 slides to go through. I'll try and keep to time. Hopefully you can see that.
Yep,
let
that's
me
nice
know.
and clear. Thank you. Yep, all good.
So I want to start off actually just to kind of, I was keen to answer some of the questions that have come up earlier in this discussion, and it's building on, I know Richard's basically touched on these, so was Geraint and Diarmaid and Kathryn. But so from my perspective, aside from my day job managing the VPI Humber Zero project, which I'll very quickly talk about, I chair the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. Over 100 companies, not necessarily fossil fuel based. Whether it's BECCS, DAX, whatever it is, CCS is a vital component to get to 2050. And whoever you talk to, we've got to scale up, no matter how you look at it, in a massive way, because again, the world is basically using fossil fuels, and it's going to be very hard to flick a switch and transition away from it. And the only other way of getting to net zero is simply to shut down industry and to sort of to move industry to places perhaps they don't want to get to meet these targets. So CCS is a necessary component. The other piece that I sort of came up, really just 2 other things I wanted to touch on. One is both the experience around CCS. So CCS has actually been deployed around the world. Why has it failed? It's failed actually really because government has chosen a different pathway to supporting other technologies that will get them to the same place. And in the past, it's been offshore wind, but simply you can't get to net zero by going with renewable technologies. You have to recognize the fact that ultimately you've got to be finding ways to mitigate our use of fossil fuels, and CCS is the only way of doing it. And there is experience out there. I heard some comments about CCS failure. Well, the failure, as I said, is that government has not chosen to back these projects in the same way that they have chosen to back other forms of other technologies to get us to the place that we're at today. And lastly, I would say you're also seeing government recognizing the opportunity for the UK. This is not about just a cost and difficult sort of conversation around how do we get there. The government's actually recognizing that the UK has a huge opportunity in its storage assets that other countries simply don't have. So they've actually recognized that it's something like 78 billion tons of strategic storage space in the North Sea. Richard alluded to the licenses that have been awarded, not least around the Lincolnshire area, but the rest of the North Sea. Other countries don't have access to that. If they actually need and want to get to net zero at the same time, the UK's got an opportunity. So there's just a couple of comments, and I've touched on them very quickly, just in the interest of time, because I know where we are on that. But let me quickly talk about Humber Zero very briefly. So another one of the Humber's critical projects in terms of looking at the sort of the areas of the Humber where you see most of the emissions. I'll put this on full screen so you can see it better. So Geraint has actually talked to this slide, I think, a little bit earlier, where you've got real concentrations around the Humber, namely around Immingham, in terms of the concentration of industry there, and then the 2 stores that have developed around it, both actually coming through the Immingham area. And as has previously been talked about, sort of the Viking store in particular that will be coming directly to Immingham, which is now a Track 2 project. A little bit about the Immingham area. So actually, sorry, I'm flipping a bit too early to that one. But a little bit about the Immingham area. It's home to just over 25% of the UK's refining capacity. 2 refineries, one of which, the Phillips refinery, who was a partner of ours in the Humber Zero project. They have already deployed plans or infrastructure around their refinery, where they are focusing on producing a particular grade of coke, petroleum grade coke, or sorry, graphite coke, which is a core component for electric vehicle batteries, and one of the only sources of supply actually in Europe, not just the UK. And they're also trying to move the refinery's product slate to produce things like sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, and products that essentially will match the energy transition from a refining standpoint. So critical industry, but also, as you can see from this slide, kind of the Immingham area as a source of emissions. Obviously, not a good picture because there's a lot of emissions, but actually from a decarbonisation perspective, as long as you want to keep that industry, it's all concentrated in the right place, and it makes it therefore an obvious place to start to decarbonise. Also home, obviously, to the power plant, or the combined heat power plant that VPI operates, which is this slide here. This is a combination of an actual photo of the CHP on the right, and then on the left you see a depiction of the capture plant that we have currently completed our feed for the Humber Zero project on the VPI plant. And you can see what actually the impact, the infrastructure you're looking to develop for the plant that we have designed for the Humber Zero project at Immingham. And it's a significant, it's almost as significant as the actual CHP itself. I think others have touched on the technology. This is a technology that it has been used for over 40 years, but not at this scale. The scale up, just as an aside here, the scale up that we've selected actually CANSOLV technology, which has been used at 1 million tons per annum commercially in both the US and Canada, and we're looking to take that to 3 million tons per annum. So that's the to give you an idea of scale. But this picture actually, or this slide, gives you a sense of the actual a physical representation of the plant itself. If you look over to the left-hand side, you'll see the Phillips refinery as well. One of the key things that in any project that as we're developing this, again, the reasons why CCS projects have not worked in the past. And my first CCS project, by the way, was back in 2005 when I was attempting to do this from Upper Peterhead with BP as a partner and SSE. Again, those projects didn't work from a government support mechanism, and that's kind of what we're trying to fix in this latest phase of industry deployment, if you will. But one of the key things around working with government is actually to make sure that a lot of what we're trying to do builds a procurement and supply chain that is UK based. So that's one of a really important part of the project, and we've been working with local vendors and developing a vendor list that's over 300 long, if you like. And we're looking to make sure that we actually have at least 50% of that supply chain coming locally. The bigger issues for these projects, and I think many of the projects that are under development in any form of CCS in the UK, is going to be around skills and construction resources. This is a representation that we've, as part of our feed program, is kind of the skill subset that we're going to need through the construction process. So through the 3 to 4 year construction timeline, when are we going to need, in terms of just pure headcount, trade and skilled workforce along the lines that you're seeing here in terms of their core competencies. And now this is not something, when you have a number of these projects actually under development at the same time, this is not going to be something that's easy to deliver in the UK, and that's going to be one of the most, so planning ahead for this is going to be a significant issue. Last but not least, because I know Simon's going to probably cut in and tell me about, remind me of my timing.
Your timing's impeccable. I was about to, but I'm not going to now because you've done it yourself. That's fine.
I'm trying to self-regulate, Simon. So last piece here. So again, this does tie back to some of the comments made by Kathryn earlier. So we've actually, the Humber Zero project has also put in for a planning application and a permit application to EA, both ourselves as VPI and Phillips 66. So we're in the process of doing that, which I would say there are, you can count them on one hand, the projects that are in this position. This is a process where we're trying to work with all the agencies to make sure that when we develop these projects on the scale that we are, that we're working through all of the pieces of those permits to cover, all of the items that you can see down on the bottom left-hand side. But this is an ongoing process, and we're trying to do that in a completely transparent way. But this is, I would say, there is a lot of learning that we're actually trying to leverage from projects overseas that have done this at, albeit at scales that we're not planning for here in the UK. Sorry, we are planning for in the UK, but haven't necessarily been done overseas. I'll leave it there and hopefully take some questions in the interest of time.
Thank you so much, and I think that's great, really, really helpful. And I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions coming through now in the next 15 minutes or so for our kind of combined Q&A, and then potentially afterwards when we kind of open the floor more broadly in a closed session. I'd be really interested, perhaps, if the three of you could pick up on that theme of economic advantage. I know, I think it was yourself, Geraint, you talked about the potential for economic disadvantage, in fact, if the region doesn't go down this path, and the way in which external investment may flow through. Also very mindful of what both Richard, you said, and Jonathan, you were talking about in terms of those skills and those longer term opportunities for individuals across the region or people who choose to move to the region. And I know if Rose is still on the call, that's a real cross-cutting theme across the commission as a whole, in terms of how we really close down some of those skills gaps or create the opportunities that we need as we go through this transition and try and do that in the most inclusive way possible. So perhaps I could just throw those two things out whilst I'm waiting for other questions and comments to come in around the link to regional competitiveness from an economy point of view, and that whole skills and transition piece. So take that as you will.
Yeah, when we did the Geraint here, when we did the cluster plan, one of the pieces of work we did, because we recognised, or I've been working with social scientists for quite a while on the value of social license to operate, and we understood that the region has a proud history of process engineering, and so we are pretty good at it. Yeah. Just not to say that we always get it right, because we're doing new stuff here, and any new process engineering technology is bespoke. None of them are cookie cutter, essentially. All refineries are different. But we have a very proud history, and we should build on that to deliver. So we're in a really good place to be able to do it. We have the skills. We have in my profession, process engineering, chemical engineering, we have a very vibrant set of chemical engineers in the Humber region looking to work. If we need to use those people, plus the people who work in the supply chain to build, manage, operate, maintain those plants. We are very well placed.
Thanks, Geraint. Jonathan or Richard, do either of you want to chip in on that, or pick up on the skills point that Jonathan, you brought through very eloquently in your presentation?
I mean, Jonathan, do you want to deal with skills? Because I think I'd like to make a comment from a wider economic perspective, but I know that was something you raised.
Yeah,
Super.
well,
Thanks.
Very briefly on skills, actually. So first of all, I've noticed in the chat, did everyone see my slides? I know I'll be sharing all the slides. Hopefully I rectified the issue of not perhaps cycling through the slides, but on skills, so actually as I mentioned in the discussion, it is an issue. It is something we're actually pre-investing in. So we have a local centre for training and managing skills for that have historically been there to manage the industry at both refineries in the local area around Immingham. And so it's kind of one of the things that actually a lot of the companies that are looking to progress these types of projects are looking to pre-invest in, because it is one of those areas that we've seen as a potential challenge going forward. Beyond that, the most important thing around these projects is government support. No matter, as I mentioned in my presentation, no matter which way we decarbonize, we're going to do that with there's a government objective, and it's going to require government support. The timing of that is critical. So how we plan these projects, how we engage with the supply chain, and how we train ahead of time workforce, it's critical when you know when you need to do that. So we're kind of doing that we are pre-investing in the local infrastructures to do this, but we're doing it ahead of really knowing for sure that the government's timeline is going to match it.
Do you think, Jonathan, that we could find ourselves, couldn't we, in a really positive on one level, but interesting convergence where we have lots of decarbonisation agendas, all of which are competing for potentially overlapping skills, or at least potentially overlapping individuals? I'm thinking about, insulating homes, retrofitting, commercial and industrial properties from a real estate point of view, looking at some of our wider transport infrastructure, of course, the whole agenda that you're focused on, and so do we potentially anticipate a point at which the competition for skills is actually almost cannibalizing the decarbonisation aspirations between those different themes, or is that, am I going too far, do you think, on that one?
Honestly, there's my personal view is actually a lot of the skills that we're talking about. There's put aside construction labour where you've got welders, fitters, scaffolders at the scale that you're needing them to do major infrastructure projects that we haven't really seen in the UK around the industry over the last 20 years. That's put that aside for a second. In terms of building an industry that's going to basically, thrive for the next 30 to 40 years, a lot of the skills that you're looking to, they're not radically different particularly around CCS than what we see today. I mean, so pipeline technology, compression, management of gases, management of coma sites, in other words, toxic material. We do that. In other words, we have flammable, we have refineries, we have chemical plants, but they're going to be different. There's an element there, but it's not a radical shift that would mean you really would worry about this. But the construction resourcing is a whole different issue, because that's a different type of workforce that kind of goes from one place to another anyway.
Gotcha. No, thank you. That's really clear. Richard, do you want to come in? Then I'm aware that Martin has both got a written question in the chat and also has his hand up, so I'm keen to bring Martin in. But Richard, over to you.
Yeah, I think I would just as a minor build to row in support of what Jonathan and Geraint are saying in terms of the sort of the skills need. There are government task forces that have now been established to look at CCS skills going forward, and the forecast increase in jobs will necessitate that, but we have the infrastructure in the Humber that can help make that happen. It's a case of working together to build on that, rather than everyone trying to tackle this problem by themselves, I think. But the point I was going to make was to the start of your question, Simon, which is a bit more about the economic opportunity. Now, Jonathan kindly volunteered that he's been involved in this industry since 2005. I came along 5 years after that, and I've been working on CCS since 2010. And for a very long time, the UK has been a global leader in the deployment of this technology. And what's happened very quickly, very recently, is a broader global market emerging for CCS, with things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the States, with new statutory instruments coming across Europe to mandate amounts of carbon storage. Our position as the leader for this is starting to disappear. And if we look at the business models, which we're all pleased are making progress, they all depend upon companies making private investment up until operations. So when you're asking companies to invest in technology and they suddenly start to have a global choice because of the emergence of these new markets, we need to act quick within the UK to maintain the appetite for investment that we need to bring about this transition, to bring about the decarbonisation of major industrial clusters like the Humber, and make sure that those opportunities don't go abroad. So from an economic perspective, in parallel with skills, there's work to be done to make sure the investment comes to the UK and our region in particular.
Gotcha. Thank you. Really clear. Right now, timings wise, we are at 10 to 3. I am keen to make sure people have a short break and then are allowed to reflect on things, and we can have a few kind of final thoughts and concluding comments. But at the same time, we're having such a great conversation now. I don't want to, chop that straight across. So I'm going to run this until 3 p.m. So another 10 or 12 minutes. So if people with questions and respondents can kind of go into quick fire round mode, that would be super. Martin, I know that you had a written question, so maybe rather than me reading that out, can you kind of recap on that? We'll go with your input, and then there are a couple of ones in the chat that I'm keen to get some perspectives on from Sam and from Neil and one or two others. But Martin, over to you first, and then we'll go to Sam's written question.
Yeah, I've got to share history of CCS because I first came across Richard during the White Rose project. So it's taken a long time to get to where we are now, that's for sure. It's really just about the opportunities in terms of the waste heat from the process. And obviously, I was picking up the point that Geraint made, was you try and design out waste as much as possible in the process. But as we need to decarbonise homes in terms of some of the facilities being quite close to villages or towns or cities, is an opportunity for, I suppose, to look at efficiency in a different way in terms of not designing out waste heat, because there's another income source for the project, as well as decarbonising residential, commercial properties close by. I just wondered how that thought process is being fitted into the design process, and whether there's conversations with local authorities who tend to develop district heating networks in the main. It's going to get what opportunities there are there for us to have those conversations with the projects. Okay, is that quick enough, Simon?
It was perfect. No, it's exemplary. Thank you, Martin. Who wants to pick up on that one first? Oh, you're muted there, Geraint. If you just unmute yourself.
I'll do a quick start. When I responded to Martin in the chat, but as part of the cluster plan, we did do a water study, and we found that South Humber Bank is water restricted. Or tight on water, and water is needed for cooling almost every industrial process, especially process industries. And when we were looking at the water demands of green hydrogen, we looked at the project by Phillips 66 and ITM. I forgot the name of it. And they designed for low water take for that project very cleverly, but you're wasting heat into the atmosphere. So when we were looking at the cluster plan, we came up with mandate 4, which is you should look to collaborate and make use of heat in the best way, both hot heat and cold heat, so that people are minimising their water take, because clean water is important to all of us. But of course, that raises a counterparty risk, which needs to be mitigated. So yes is the answer. You do need to look at collaborating to share cool and heat, but I leave it to the industrialists to tell me how it is because of the counterparty risk.
It just makes the point that we're talking about a systems level issue here, aren't we?
Yeah.
Rather than a sequence of individualized exercises, which has been an underpinning point that all speakers have been making so far. Jonathan and or Richard, would you like to jump in on that one at all?
Yeah,
otherwise
I can quickly to add to that. So I'll just on a slightly different vein. When you're talking about, again, CCS, whichever pathway you're looking at for CCS, it's an energy intensive process. So whatever you're doing, you're putting more into basically just burning a fossil fuel of some kind or anything, and you're putting energy into, so you're looking for efficiencies wherever you can find them. So the way I would sort of, whenever I hear this question, it's really about how do you make the process in general be the most efficient? And so again, around industry, so we don't have a lot of residents around the Immingham area, but so it's a combined heat and power plant. It's one of the most efficient places that you'd want to start from a use of energy. If you're not producing power, you're producing steam, and you know, you're using the steam if you don't use it in an industrial process to produce power. So if you decarbonize that by you know, almost by as a reflection of that, you're actually doing it at the most efficient sort of level, which is the same as when you try and find ways of using excess energy. But that's all I would say.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really super. Yeah. Richard, I can see you just unmiked, so yeah, unmuted rather.
I think Jonathan's answered it really well, Sam. There isn't a great deal to add. I guess the constraint that we all have is this conversion of existing assets, and they tend to be in locations that aren't in proximity to places where you can utilise that. But yeah, I completely agree with where Martin's coming from. I think looking at solutions on a holistic basis, working as a cluster to try and, you know, reach net zero is the only way that we'll achieve it.
Super. Samantha Herbert put a question into chat. I'm aware, Chris, that you've got your hand up. I am going to come to you quite soon about, you know, reflecting on how interesting the presentations were and wondering whether any of our speakers, perhaps our colleagues from the Environment Agency, might talk briefly about how the risks and opportunities for marine and/or terrestrial diversity are being considered. Do you want to add anything to the question that you typed in, Sam, before we offer that up to our speakers to respond to?
No, just nice and simple one. Just wanted to bring the nature biodiversity conversation in.
Great, thank you for doing that. Who would like to jump in and address that from whichever of your perspectives you have?
I can add very quickly. Now, I'm not very good at doing two things at once, so I haven't read the question, Samantha, but hopefully I get the context. What I would say is that for all development consent order applications, we have an obligation for a 10% net gain in biodiversity. So you're right, it's fundamentally built in as a statutory requirement into making sure that these large scale projects do produce positive outcomes for nature. Now, whether that's through mitigation and beyond mitigation, or through off-site exercises, etc., I think that's for each and every applicant to determine. But I think that it's helpful that we're guided by that need and necessity in doing so. From a Drax perspective specifically, we have our own targets and goals on how we make sure that we source fibre from a place that has positive ecological benefits as well. So positive for the climate, positive for people, and positive for nature are 2 or 3 core objectives of ours corporately.
Thanks, Richard. I'm aware that from a regulatory point of view, this is probably a little bit closer to Natural England than it is to Environment Agency, unless I'm wrong in terms of where my regulatory boundaries should be. But if Kathryn's still with us and/or Rosa would like just to make any comment on that, that would be valuable.
Yeah, it is. But I suppose we would look at any discharges to water from the site. So I suppose more inland than your question is about. But yeah, during a permitting process and for ongoing regulation, discharges to water are extremely important, and the temperature and water quality aspects of that.
So essentially, it would be treated as any other planning or industrial permitting process, would it? Rather than being made a special case as such, it would just fall under the normal consultee process from statutory and other consultees. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Simon, can I make one comment there?
Oh yes, of course.
Just very briefly. I noticed that there's a couple of questions on pipelines, and probably this group may not be the best. You know, you haven't got an offshore operator there, but enough. Just one very brief comment that I do know from working with, in this case, with the Harbour Energy Viking store. If you to manage these types of issues, having existing infrastructure is a big benefit. In other words, if you're not building new things and actually having to disturb new areas, it's kind of a big benefit. I'll give you one specific example. So the existing pipelines that go offshore to and use existing basically coastal crossing areas is massively important, because it's effectively bringing pipelines, large pipelines that have been underwater, crossing, you know, normally areas of you know, of natural interest, and then transitioning to an onshore pipeline that's probably only 3-4 meters deep. It's a big deal in terms of disturbance of wildlife, etc. So having existing infrastructure or existing pipelines is a huge advantage in that regard.
And that speaks, I think, without putting words into your mouth or intending to grant to some of what you were saying earlier in terms of that kind of legacy value that we have within the region. And I guess Diarmaid is also, was pointing towards the clusters that, from my perspective at least, were concentrated into places where we had that industrial heritage, where that infrastructure, legacy or currently active, was in place. Yeah.
Yep.